Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Dr. Daniel Worthington. He's the director of the papers of Abraham Lincoln at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And so Dr. Worthington sees things that no one else has ever seen that Abraham Lincoln wrote and handled, and we thought because it was President's Day, it would be just a great thing to get you to stop by, Dr. Worthington, and share with us today. So thank you so much for taking this time to be with us today.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
So we talk about President's Day. We talk about the different presidents we've had all through history. And a lot of people will talk about Abraham Lincoln and they'll say, really, they think he was the greatest president that we ever had. Where do you place Lincoln really in our history?
Well, I would say that Lincoln is probably the greatest president. Certainly, there are arguments to be made for Franklin Roosevelt as being very close to Lincoln, and certainly Washington, George Washington. Each of those men had unique challenges. Of course, Washington had the challenge of creating the country out of the Constitution, and Roosevelt faces the challenges of the Great Depression and the World War II. But Lincoln really faces some unique challenges for some number of reasons. Lincoln is, unlike Washington and Roosevelt, Lincoln is largely although he's well known politically, certainly in the country, his term, and he only really served on a federal level for 2 years in Congress in the 1840s. He was a legislator in Illinois, so his legislative period and his governmental experience was very limited. And he gets elected, and almost as soon as he gets elected, we have a secession of 7 states who had promised to secede from the Union if Lincoln was elected, despite the fact that Lincoln assured them that there was nothing to fear from him being elected. So Lincoln faces what would be an existential crisis for the Union almost as soon as he gets elected. Lincoln is also faced in a certain sense that he has to wait to become president. So all the events that occur between November and March of 1861 are out of his hands to a large extent. And Lincoln does not really involve himself very much in trying to prevent secession from happening. He just doesn't feel that's not his job at that stage. He keeps himself very, he doesn't say a whole lot during the whole period of time. So when he comes into office in March of 1861, he's facing with what he considers to be a rebellion. He considers the Confederacy to be illegitimate, secession to be not illegitimate. So the Union is under threat. And Lincoln has been dealing with this for a long time. And because of slavery, because of the plan to extend slavery. So Lincoln is facing a threat to the Union, a threat to the American experiment with representative democracy. He's faced with a group of people that want to extend slavery, which he believes to be an evil. And while Lincoln doesn't feel he has any right to interfere with slavery in the states as it exists, he's absolutely opposed to it expanding. He believes that is against what the founding fathers wanted. And Lincoln is convinced that if the Union is broken up, then any chance for representative democracy, any chance for the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or equal rights for all people would be devastated. Because Lincoln does not have other democratic countries out there to back up on. The United States is the only real representative democracy. The rest of Europe is largely either constitutional monarchs or they are absolute monarchies. So Lincoln is facing with a lot of challenges, not the least of which is, of course, the Union. And then, of course, he also has to deal with the issue of slavery, what to do about slavery. Lincoln is convinced that slavery is the cause of the war, but he doesn't see he has the constitutional right even as the commander in chief initially to end slavery. So he's got a very difficult process to try to. First of all, a couple of things he has to do. Number one, he has to try to. He's a constitutional lawyer. He's a lawyer. He believes in the Constitution, so he needs to sustain a society which laws are obeyed the Constitution is obeyed, law and order is sustained, and at the same time, he's also got to deal with slavery, which is denying rights to certain groups of people, denying them citizenship rights. So he has to really sort of figure out how to handle those two things, and it's a very tricky thing to do, and especially in the fact that he's also dealing with a massive war for 4 years. So that is why I think he's probably the greatest president, given what he has to deal with and how he handles it over that 4 year period.
So you're saying in his mind, and probably it was the case, if America falls, if this experiment ends, there's no other real example at that point
Right.
of democracy. And so he knows that. And
Yes.
you mentioned the long wait. You know, we tend to think, oh, well, inauguration day is January, right? And
Right.
but he has to wait till March and see this. And
Right.
it's a pretty dangerous situation, even getting to Washington, isn't it?
It is. Lincoln is, well, the other thing Lincoln is dealing with, which I didn't mention, is that Lincoln is getting death threats. And we see a lot of those in the papers of Abraham Lincoln from letters to him. He got a lot of death threats, both written, and there were plots to try to kidnap him, kill him on the way to Washington. There is no Secret Service in those days. Lincoln does not really, the other problem that Lincoln faces is that he is, of course, under threat from mostly Southern radicals, I would say. But Lincoln also is a person that does not believe the president should be behind a Secret Service detail, behind a wall. The president is the people's office. So Lincoln, on his way, is very reluctant to have security. He does have Pinkerton detectives with him. And even when he gets to Washington, he is very reluctant to walk around with security. The White House does not have any security. You would think that the Army was there. The Army is not there. Lincoln does not want that to be the case because he wants people to feel like they can come to talk to him if they need to talk to him. So the White House is, I always say, is wide open in a sense. So yes, he's under threat too. His physical danger is being threatened constantly, and there are plots to, of course, eliminate him if they can during the war and even before he gets to Washington. So yes, you're correct.
And you say he really doesn't shy away from any of that. In other words, he doesn't want a barrier between him and the people. He
Correct.
doesn't want a barrier between him and the soldiers either. He really puts himself at risk, often going actually to the battlefield, doesn't he?
He does. He spends a fair amount of time. He never goes out to the Western theater. He stays in the East. He never really leaves, doesn't really go out of Washington that far, but he does. He goes to Norfolk. He goes to that area, Hampton Roads area. He actually is the one that sort of pushes the Union Army to capture Norfolk because he said, "Why don't you just go in there and do it?" He does go to see Grant on many occasions in the war. He's in Richmond the day or two after the Confederate soldiers leave. So he does put himself in danger because, of course, there could have been Confederate snipers still around. He's close to the front lines. He is not, again, he doesn't walk around with a whole cadre of security in front of him. He does make himself available to soldiers. That's part of what attracts people to him is his empathy, his willingness to listen, and I think that's another thing that makes him unique, is that he is not detached from his people or the soldiers. And that comes through in the letters he gets as well.
So you mentioned the letters, and you mentioned them earlier as well, like some of the death threats and so forth. So
Yeah.
I've seen where you've asked out for letters and stuff in the past. So you've seen things that none of us have ever seen, and perhaps just only a handful of people have seen that Abraham Lincoln has written or that have been written to him. And so, what are some of the things you find that are especially interesting or would interest us about Lincoln that the rest of us wouldn't know about?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, there's many things, but one of the things we're working on right now is as the project is, we're in 1858. So Lincoln has debated Douglas, 7 debates, makes him a national figure. Those are covered all over the country. Becomes probably one of the leading candidates for president in 1860, but Lincoln does lose that election. He's disappointed in that election. And what's interesting about it is that Lincoln thinks that, what I find interesting is that Lincoln writes a letter to someone and says, well, you know, I'm happy I was part of that election, but I'm going to fade away now. I'm not going to come back. And hopefully I did something for liberty and civil rights that will be remembered, which is interesting. He's certainly not, because Lincoln, what people don't know about Lincoln is that Lincoln is not a full-time politician. As a matter of fact, he's a full-time lawyer. And if he doesn't practice law or hear cases, he doesn't make any money. So we get many letters after, in 1855, he runs for Senate. In 1855, he loses that election, which I think in some sense is more devastating to him than in 58, because in 58, he knew he was going to lose. He knew that the legislature had gone to the Democrats. In 55, it was very nebulous about, he led in the first 3 or 4 ballots. And then there were certain people that would not vote for him, never vote for him, people who actually became his allies. And so in 55 and 54, he writes letters to people and say, look, you know, I haven't been in my law practice for 6 or 7 months, and no money has come in. And, you know, we don't have enough money for household items. And we assume that Lincoln, of course, is well off. And Lincoln is certainly a good middle-class lawyer. He certainly does well, but when he doesn't practice law and he's not out on the circuit or riding the circuit, he's not making money. So he's sort of desperate in times for people to pay him what they owe him, which is interesting in and of itself. Another thing that's interesting about Lincoln is when he's president, a lot of people send Lincoln a lot of ideas for winning the war more quickly. So there's all kinds of ideas for weapons, ideas for like chemical weapons, for, you know, rifled cannons, for, you know, repeating rifles, ideas for, you know, socks to help the infantry march better. There's really no one to see those letters, but Lincoln sort of takes an interest in this. And he does test some of these things himself. And one of the ideas is he has someone make a little mock-up cannon, that the idea had a cannon, and gave it to Tad, his youngest son, which we have that artifact here. So that's another interesting thing about Lincoln, is that he's very much his one-man sort of scientific advisory agency. And now we know science is so much a part of the military these days. In those days, it was, you know, the military was very, very reluctant to embrace science as a way of breaking the stalemate. Lincoln was very much open to science in that sense. And, you know, the third thing I would say is that Lincoln's tenure wasn't just about the Civil War. It was also about some legislation that he and the Republicans had wanted for many years, that sort of set the stage for the post-war sort of explosion in the industry, passing the Banking Act and creating a national banking structure was one of the things they did. The Homestead Act, which, you know, encouraged people to move out west, and that was a huge thing after the war. And then, you know, a third thing is the Land Grant Act, which encourages engineering and agricultural colleges. That revolutionizes American higher education, and we still have land grant colleges today, and they are at the center of engineering and agricultural research. University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana is a land grant college. So those are things that not many people know about Lincoln. Now, of course, when he's in the White House, he doesn't have to worry about money too much. We don't know what would have happened after. That's the other thing is about Lincoln. We're not sure what he would have done after he was in the White House. He always planned on coming back to Springfield to practice law with his son. We think he probably would have ended up in Chicago. We don't know what kind of person he would have been. So that's another, you know, aspect about Lincoln, is the speculation of what he would have done after his second term in 68. We just don't know, because we never got that far. But there's so many interesting things about him.
Absolutely. So our listeners are thinking, okay, save the Union, slavery was abolished. But if you went to NC State or you mentioned University of Illinois, land
Right,
grant
right,
institutions,
right.
and then the Homestead Act, which really
Yes,
helped folks after the war. So many things, and you're able to see the letters. So when you have the kind of access that people had to Lincoln, they're also able to write him, and he's reading the letters and all kinds of ideas and what that must have been like, in the
sure,
midst of
sure.
this terrible situation. I've got to ask, it was Tad that died, wasn't it? In 62 or 63,
It, it,
his
it's
son.
it's Willie. It's Willie
Willie.
who dies. He dies in February of 62. Of a we don't well probably of a fever. Of course, Lincoln is devastated. This is right before uh, they're going to launch a massive invasion of Virginia, the Peninsula Campaign. We do have Lincoln and his wife, Mary. Don't think was ever the same.
Mm,
She was, she had lost another child. Eddie had died in 1850,
mhm,
and so she was quite never this. And of course, then Lincoln dies himself. So it's very sad. I mean, there's only two presidents that have had a son die in the White House while they were president, and it was Lincoln and Calvin Coolidge. And it is interesting, though. Lincoln, of course, got a lot of letters and condolence, but one of the letters he received was from former President Franklin Pierce, who was a Democrat, and Pierce had been elected in 52, but right before they went to inauguration, he and his wife and their children were on a train, and there's a train accident, and his oldest son was killed.
mm,
So he had suffered. I think he had also had another child die. So I think there's their last son who was killed in a very tragic and gruesome way, and so he knew the pain. And of course, I don't think he and his wife really ever got over it. I think it really was a shadow on the whole presidency. So he writes Lincoln and tells Lincoln he understands how it is to be now having to take on this massive responsibility, but also grieving a child. So Lincoln, as people are grieving, uh, the death and the death and the crippling of their husbands and their children, Lincoln's also grappling with this. So Lincoln has a lot of empathy for people that are struggling, that husbands are and wives are, and all these people. Lincoln is especially attuned to that, I think.
mm. I hear you talk a lot about the empathy that Lincoln had for people, and that was part of why he was out among the soldiers. And there was no Secret Service yet, but even like the Pinkertons, he was available to folks. So as we think about his life and some of the things you've seen, what are some lessons that we can take away from the life of Lincoln?
Well, I think it's Lincoln is a unique person in many ways, but he's also very relatable. I think one of the things that you can learn from Lincoln is perseverance. Lincoln was a person who did struggle, did have failures. He lost, the two elections to the Senate in 55 and 58. Um, he suffered loss of children. He struggled with Stephen Douglas was his rival. Stephen Douglas was sort of eclipsed Lincoln as a lawyer and as an orator in many ways, and he struggled in the war with people with opposing him, um, people that were wanting him to move faster, people that wanted him to move slower on slavery and emancipation. But Lincoln always persevered. He never really became so distraught and so depressed that he could not persevere. He knew his responsibility. I think that's another thing we can also learn from Lincoln is that Lincoln took responsibility.
Mm,
As the commander in chief and as the president, he bore the responsibility and he took it. Uh, when Fredericksburg happened in 62 and it was a terrible Union defeat, all the Union defeats, Lincoln bore the responsibility for those. He really never took credit for the victories. He gave the generals that credit, but he took responsibility for the defeats. He took, I think another thing we don't know about him, which is part of his responsibility, is he really took responsibility as the commander in chief to urge the generals, sometimes who were reluctant to fight, to fight. He was always looking for a general who was willing to fight, and he got that in Grant. He didn't have to do that anymore with Grant, but he did that with some other generals. Always with the idea of winning the war, getting slavery back, getting the Union back together. Not to, he was somebody who really did his homework on military things. He didn't have any military experience very much when he became president. But he took responsibility. He never blamed the Buchanan administration for the predicament he was in, so to speak. He never blamed Buchanan. He accepted what Buchanan did and what Buchanan's views away. He just got to work on trying to solve the problems. So I think responsibility is one thing. Another thing I think we can learn from Lincoln is Lincoln never really takes himself that seriously. He is obviously the president of the United States. He's commander in chief, but he keeps his sense of humor. He keeps his humility. He is able to, pull himself out and not see himself as the savior of the Union, but as he sees himself as an instrument in a certain sense. That God knows what's going to happen. He says this in one of his speeches. God knows what's going to happen. I'm an instrument. I am not the person who's going to. I'm not savior. I'm an instrument. And so his humility stays, and he's able to keep his sense of humor. He's also able. I think another thing we can learn from him is that Lincoln was hopeful about the American experiment. He never got despondent about the American experiment, the American government. He never believed that secession was a good idea or right. He always believed that the Union was better together, even with the differences between the North and the South. He did not favor, as some Northern abolitionists did, letting the South go. He didn't think that was not what we should have done, he thought, and he fought to keep that. But he was always hopeful. He never really, even in the darkest days of the war, even when he believes he's losing in 64, he's not going to win the presidency in 64. He is still saying to his cabinet, okay, we're not going to win. We have to do something now to save the Union. And what we may have to declare peace. We may have to go and sue for peace here. He hopes to win, but he's realistic in seeing that he might not win. But I think he maintains that hope, I think. And I think the other thing we can learn from Lincoln is that Lincoln, he never really saw the enemy, the Confederacy, as the enemy in the sense that they should always be the enemy. In his final second inaugural, he is preaching already reconciliation. He's preaching that we're brothers and sisters. He's also preaching that we're equally responsible for slavery and equally responsible for the war. This is God's punishment for us. And if the war has to go on until we, every lash and every drop of blood is paid for, we might have to do that. I don't want to, he says, but he knows that there's going to come a point that we're going to have to reconcile with the brothers, and we have to forget the past. And I think that's one of the things he says, we really do have to, put on that olive branch to each other. Now, what would Lincoln have done when the South is in Reconstruction is attacking African Americans that are freed? I don't think Lincoln would have stood for that. But we don't know what would have happened there. But I don't think he would have stood for that. I don't think he would have allowed the war. By that time, Lincoln is convinced that slavery must end for the Union to be won again. And so I think those are things that we can learn from him for sure. There's so many other things, but those are the things I would say are some of the top things we can learn from his life.
Well, those are some great things. I mean, and that's what made it possible for really the Union to be saved.
Yes.
You mentioned he thought he was going to lose, in 64, just how odd it is. He's running against one of his former generals, right? Meade.
Correct. Mhm.
And is all this true that he would go to meet with Meade and wait for an hour and all that? I mean,
Yes, yes. I mean, that's another thing you can learn from him. I mean, he would, uh, he tried to work with him. He worked with people that were opposed to him.
mhm.
Um, a lot of the generals that he met with were Democrats. Meade and McClellan and all those were Democrats. And but he said, okay, I'm not. I don't mind who. I don't care who it is. I just want to. I want to preserve the Union.
Yeah.
When people were saying that Grant was drinking to excess, he said, well, you know, if Grant is, if that's what, if Grant's performance is the result of drinking to excess, then we should give other generals some liquor. Um,
Because
but
he wanted a general that would fight, didn't
he
he?
did. He wanted a general that would engage the enemy. And Lincoln, I think, comes to the conclusion that we have to defeat the Confederate Army. That's what Grant comes to the conclusion. We have to defeat the Confederate Army to win this to end the rebellion. And they were right. And so I think we learn from that is that Lincoln is willing to compromise to a certain degree. He's also willing to grow. Lincoln does not start the war with the idea that this war is going to be a war to end slavery. It's a war to preserve the Union. Gradually, though, as things go along, he sees that in order to preserve the Union, we have to end slavery. It has to end. We can't let 600,000 people die and then preserve the institution that caused this. That would be a slap in the face of the soldiers and the families that sacrificed. And so Lincoln is able to sell that, um, sell the end of slavery and sell the 13th Amendment. And that's a major accomplishment for America was ending slavery.
Mm.
It puts us on a completely different track going forward, a track that we're still sort of on trying to deal with the legacy of slavery. But he puts us on the track and says we cannot preserve that institution. We've been saying for the last 20 years that the slave power conspiracy is the threat to the Union. We can't let that come back because it'll just be a threat again.
Mhm.
So I think we can learn some things from him in the sense of how he works with people, how he was willing to compromise and work with people who didn't necessarily like him and insulted him. Um, his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, runs against him in '64. Lincoln just doesn't really say anything. Chase eventually resigns. Lincoln accepts the resignation, but he puts him on the Supreme Court. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the kind of guy he's. I mean, nobody would. If you think about that, I mean, the guy was disloyal to Lincoln, but Lincoln puts him on the Supreme Court because he knew how talented Chase was.
Yeah.
Chase just was just not very. Chase wasn't good as a politician, but he was an excellent jurist, and so Lincoln saw that, and
Yeah.
he was, and that's an amazing thing. We don't see that very often today.
He was able to look past it to put his team together, right?
Correct, correct.
So the average person and wants to learn more about Lincoln, you have all kinds of access that,
Yeah.
we really don't have or can't see, but how can we learn more about Lincoln?
Well, there's many ways. Of course, Lincoln is written about more than any other person other than Jesus Christ. So Lincoln is is very difficult. But there's a lot of good books about Lincoln. Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin is a good book to read about his presidency. There's some new biographies that have come out in recent years. That's been written. There's a recent biography that's been written. That's won the Pulitzer Prize. That's a good book. There's a lot of good books. But if you want to see Lincoln sort of um, in the sense of what he does and what he writes and who writes him, you can always access our product, which is the papers of Abraham Lincoln.org. And that we're published documents up to 1858. So you can see the documents, you can see transcriptions of the documents. You can also see annotations. So it puts the documents in context. So you can see things that people wrote to Lincoln and things that Lincoln wrote. Another thing that's really interesting that we have is the Lincoln Log, which is Lincoln day by day. Now that follows, so basically the Lincoln Log follows Lincoln and what he does every day of his life that we know where he was and what he did.
Hmm.
That's at the lincolnlog.org. that's really useful for people that are not really initiated to Lincoln yet, and they want to know about, was he in my town? Did he, did he come to a certain place in Illinois? Now, Lincoln doesn't travel very much. He's not a big traveler. He goes to Kentucky and he goes to Kansas and he goes to Michigan and Iowa and some places like that. But you sort of get an idea of what he's doing every day. You get an idea of the people he's talking to who come and visit him in the White House, and you also get an idea from the letters too, who's writing him. Um, and so another source that people can use is the law practice of Abraham Lincoln. If you're really interested in Lincoln's legal career and his law cases, you can go there and look. And there's just so many other resources. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum also has a very good page on Abraham Lincoln. And we've done some really good work on the Gettysburg Address. We own one of 5 versions of the Gettysburg Address here.
Wow.
And it was purchased in World War II by Illinois students, putting in pennies and quarters and nickels. And I think they raised about $10,000 during World War II. And then Marshall Field of Chicago gave the remaining money for that. So we have one of the 5 copies. There's another one in the White House. Most people know the one at the White House. So we have the Gettysburg Address. So this is a good resource to also learn about Lincoln as well. And if people are in Springfield, I would encourage them to come to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. We have the museum is here. Lincoln's home is here, which is where he lived, his only home that he owned, where he lived before he went to Washington. And we also have the Lincoln tomb, where Lincoln, Willie, Mary, and Willie are buried at the Lincoln tomb, which is a couple of miles away. So all of that is interesting stuff to see, but there's also things that you can learn there. And what's sort of interesting about the tomb is in the middle of a big cemetery where a lot of Lincoln's friends and cohorts in Illinois live. Not live, they are buried there. So you can learn a lot just from going to those sites and going to books about Lincoln. So I would encourage people, if they're really interested in Lincoln, and if you have a relative that you think may have written Lincoln, and you want to know, you can always contact me. I'm at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. You can contact me, and I'll be happy to look for you. We have a really nice collection of papers here that are Illinois related. So if you're Illinois related, but we have about 100,000 documents in our database. So we have everything. We have the biggest collection of Lincoln stuff you can imagine. And we've done a lot of work in trying to, figure out what Lincoln's up to, especially if you're interested in Lincoln's early life. We've done a lot of work in his early life, about his period in the legislature here in Illinois, where he really sort of does a lot of interesting things. And he's really involved in a lot of Whig and early Whig politics and things. So those are some ideas, I would say. Lincoln is not hard to find. There's interesting things. Something about there's a lot of stories about Lincoln that probably aren't true, and he's probably the most difficult person that way, because there's so many stories about him. But we try to be as accurate as we can and as honest we can and truthful as we can about him. We don't try to hide who he is or what he was. Lincoln is not, he's not what some people claim he is. But I think we as an institution are committed to his legacy in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah, it's great. Well, you all do some great work, and our folks could take a look at it if they go to presidentlincoln.illinois.gov, right? And
Correct.
can get access. I think get access to your archives, and really, if you're in the Springfield area, stop by, see the Presidential Library and Museum, and not too far away, there's the graves there of President Lincoln and some of his children and Miss Mary Todd Lincoln as well. So it's just a good opportunity, isn't it, Dr. Worthington, to pick up on some history and be able to be in the place where Lincoln spent so much time.
Yes, he spent pretty much. Lincoln lived in Springfield from 1837 to February 11th, 1861. He left Springfield that day to go to Washington, and he would do a circuit. He would speak, and then he would do the same circuit when they brought him back
Mm.
home to be buried here in Springfield. Mary insisted that he be buried in Springfield. He could have been buried anywhere he wanted, clearly, but so they came back the same way. And we commemorate those things occasionally. We commemorate his death and his burial with ceremonies, and they've done a lot of work at the cemetery to sort of recreate the entrance where he came in 1865, and that cemetery is still still there, and the original holding cell before they built the tomb is there, and so there's all kinds of interesting things there to see, and it's also in Springfield and also Springfield as well, and so also the other sites as well.
Well, you've shared a lot with us. I could talk with you all day, my friend, but this is real helpful to us, especially on a special day like President's Day. And thank you for taking the time to share with us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm happy to do it anytime.
We want to thank you for taking the time to listen today. If you know someone that would benefit from this podcast, please share it. Remember, every little thing, it really does help. It really does matter. We're truly better when we work together. We're better together. Thank you.